Thank you, Arta Galata, for this Ask the Author campaign that you're doing. You've sent me 82 questions. Now, obviously, we can, for want of time, only select 5 at random and answer those. I'm leaving out some of the more outlandish ones. There was one entertaining question on whether I believe in time travel. The answer is no. But more seriously, Tinu Vejan had a question on how long does it take you to research and then write. It really depends on the project. For example, my third book, which in many ways is the lightest, is a collection of essays, short essays that I wrote over a period of 3 years. And that it was often things that interested me, things I was reading about, and then decided to sort of dig a little deeper. But they were not intense in any respect. My first book, on the other hand, that took me 6 years to do. The first thing to do was, of course, to get your head around all the paperwork that exists. So my protagonist's private papers were sitting in a trunk in Bangalore, so I went and gained access to that. And that took a while to really understand and read and sort of make sense of. Then there was all the archival material. So there was material in the National Archives in Delhi, there's material in the Kerala State Archives. Then my protagonist was also, she passed away only in the 1980s, so there were people who knew her, and there was a lot of anecdotal information of value. You take these things critically, you analyze them with a certain distance, but it's worth collecting that kind of information. There was that. Then there was the academic perspectives. There was, for example, if I'm discussing the matrilineal system, it's worth going out and finding what the most recent research and the most acclaimed research on that can teach you. So in the case of matrilineal, I benefited a lot from J. Devika's research. G. Arunima's book on Madhumakatayam. So, academic perspectives like that, which you can combine with the archival material that you found. Then, of course, the British Archives at the British Library in London, the India Office records. But often there was also material that was not easy to access. There was this one journal that I wanted to find called the Feudatory and Zamindari India, which I couldn't find it in India, I couldn't find it in London. Finally managed to trace the full collection in America, and then that's where I finally got access to that material. So yeah, it was a lot of travel. It was a lot of going out to places and looking for material, looking in places where you wouldn't originally have gone and searched. For example, there were these diaries of a person, a contemporary of these characters in the book in the 1920s. Covers a 2.5 year period in 3 volumes. Personal opinions on various things that happened in Travancore at that time. And it was impossible to find this. I knew that the diaries had been auctioned a few years before, but the auction house wouldn't tell me who bought it. So it took quite a while to actually finally get my hands on them. And unfortunately, the book was already published by the time I did. So the material from the diary never ended up, making its way into the book. But in that sense, yeah, even after the book was done, I was still looking for material connected to the book. So yeah, it depends. The research process can take its own time, and then of course multiple drafts of the actual writing, because you don't want to inflict something that's half-baked on your audience, on your readers. And if you're also, I was aware that I was writing about a relatively obscure topic, so I had to try and make the writing a little lively. So that was also another reason the book took 6 years. So yeah, it really depends on the project. Anyway, thank you for your question, Tinu Vijay. This is the second question I'm taking, which is from Madhurya. And there are several questions like this, where Madhurya says that she reads a lot of history, but she's not really sure how students of history work, what on a day-to-day basis, is the lifestyle or the pattern for a historian. Now, this really varies from person to person. In my case, it depends entirely on whether I'm in a research cycle or not. So usually for any one project, there'll be multiple research cycles with breaks in the middle. Otherwise, it becomes quite impossible to keep your own sanity. So if it's a research cycle, it can get fairly intense and isolating. So for instance, when I was doing my second book, The Rebel Sultans, I remember there was this 3-month phase I decided to focus on one specific thing, and it had to be done in those 3 months because I had already decided to reward myself with a little excursion to some place after that. So I decided that the tickets were booked, all of that was done. I had to finish what I had set my eyes on before that. So that meant about 10 hours every day in the library, in the archives, etc. So you get your desk by 9 in the morning, you leave only after 8 in the evening, which is when the place closes. And there was this one time when I realized that the only words I had uttered all week were to the people in the canteen area, questions like how much is the sandwich for? But other than that, I hadn't actually spoken to anyone for a whole week. And that was an interesting realization, but it gives you a sense of, what that kind of research can entail, because you really do have to lock yourself up. At least I do. I have to lock myself up and really focus. It's usually the same when I'm doing the first draft of a book, which is, for me, the most difficult part is that getting that initial first draft where you get that original structure. You can flesh it out later, you can sort of add to it later, add the layers up afterwards in a more sort of relaxed fashion, but that first draft is always tough. So that again is chained to a desk, and sometimes, again with Rebel Sultans, when I was doing the first draft, I was in London, and making as that I did from my own the place where I was staying, and getting my lunch ready every afternoon wasn't something I wanted to do because it would break that flow of work that you were in the middle of. And then I remember my answer to that was, for an entire 5 or 6 week period, was to simply eat grapes for lunch. It was quite horrible. I haven't eaten a grape since, because that was enough grapes for a lifetime, I thought. But yeah, so it can get fairly challenging and demanding. You also end up losing weight, which is perhaps a welcome side effect. But then once you're done with a research phase like that, then I usually give myself a break. I go travel somewhere. That's when I do all the events that I enjoy doing, public events, etc. So if you're cooped up and not socializing at all for months on end, and you're only with yourself, with your books and your desk, then there may be several months when you're everywhere all the time and on stage in multiple places and talking about your books and your writing and things like that. So that's how I tend to balance things out. Different people have different ways. A lot of friends of mine actually teach on a regular basis. So for them, they find that break partly in that, which is that they have their research cycles, but then they also have these teaching cycles where they do interact a great deal with a large number of people and actually disseminate knowledge. So different people have different methods, and no one researcher works in the same way, I think. So yeah, if you're considering a life of research, be prepared for these phases of isolation and locking yourself up and chaining yourself to desks. So this is the third question we're taking for the Ask the Author campaign by Ata Galata. And this one's from Divya Mary. And she says, why are you choosing aristocratic titles and themes for your books? Well, book number 3, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, isn't really very much an aristocratic thing. It features Bhakti saints, including Dalit saints. It includes social reformers and crusaders against caste like Jyotirao Phule, and so on. So I don't think that criticism stands out for that book. The second book is about the sultans of the Deccan, which is indeed about kings, etc. But that, again, these tend to be kings who are sort of given the short end of the stick. They're marginalized when it comes to the Mughals and the Marathas. They end up languishing in the shadows of these two towering political powers that exist in India. So I wanted to resurrect the sultans of the Deccan for that reason. But the first book, The Ivory Throne, although it is about a queen, I'm assuming you haven't read the book, because the book isn't actually about royalty and how great they were. It's really about deconstructing that whole edifice of royalty. Firstly, how it was constructed, the legitimizing processes involved, the complications of the matrilineal system, the succession battles that it entailed. It was also about power, really. It wasn't really about kings and queens and all the glamorous things they did. It was more about power and how power was negotiated between different segments of society, between different players and power brokers. At least that's how I attempted to do that book, which is why my protagonist is somebody who actually renounces that whole royal background and eventually gives it up and denies that existence and converts herself into a completely new figure as an ordinary person and dies in obscurity at the end. And I found that personal arc also quite interesting. But yeah, in general, power as a subject interests me a great deal because it's this recurring thing in history, right? People constructing these narratives around power, people constructing these instruments of legitimacy, people using hard power, combining it with legitimacy, and creating something that they think is going to endure for a very long time. And then, like a house of cards, everything comes down, collapsing down. And I think that process interests me a great deal about the construction. I suppose you see that in rebel sultans also, which is that you have these military states that are established by these sultans, firstly in rebellion against the powers in Delhi, but then there are these internal factions that they have to play against one another. But finally, the weight of those internal contradictions results in the splitting up of an empire. The successor states last for a while, but even they ultimately cannot survive. All of this is really about power, and it is true that power and power dynamics are something that greatly interest me. So this is the fourth question for Ata Galata's Ask the Author campaign, and this one is from Ajay Prabhu, who asks how it is that anybody working on history can address their biases. So there's no shortcut for this. Frankly, you address your biases by reading as widely as possible. The more you read on one particular subject, the more perspectives you bring on board, the more you are equipped to handle this problem of bias. On the one hand, no writer on history or no writer or anything really can claim to be 100% objective for the simple reason that we're all human beings, and human beings naturally have a degree of bias in anything they do. What you can do is try and minimize your bias, and that comes from as extensive reading as possible. The more you know, the more capable you are at handling certain questions. For example, you read the latest academic perspectives on a certain theme or a certain topic. Then you also read reviews of those academic perspectives, because in the reviews by equally distinguished academics, you can find certain holes in the argument, certain weaknesses that may not have appeared at your own initial reading. So that usually helps. So it's always a process of reading more and reading in a critical way, reading things not accepting anything at face value, but always interrogating the text itself while you're reading. So simple things, what is the source? If some claim is made, what is the source here? You go and find the source and the veracity of that material, whether it holds water, whether it's capable of standing up to scrutiny. So that way, if you read more and more, the more widely you read, you end up being able to handle this problem of bias. You try and do your best to minimize bias. As I said, if you have there will be a degree of bias, but try and keep it to the bare minimum, and that much is possible. We can make an honorable effort to try and keep our biases away. Firstly, also by acknowledging that these biases exist, and then trying to rectify that by gaining as much knowledge as possible from as many voices as possible. So this is the fifth and the final question for the Ask the Author campaign by Ata Galata, and this one is from Anand Madhusudan, who's asking about the different kinds of methods that are used by historians in India and abroad. Now, overall, as history is done today, there are certain scientific methods, certain standards that don't have any geography. There are certain standards of veracity and method which can be applied in multiple places. The difference often lies in the kind of material that is available. For example, people who think that true history is only available in written records, that doesn't quite hold water in India, for the simple reason that as a caste-based society, only a certain elite section of Indian society had access to literacy and writing, etc. So if you're going to privilege merely written records, you're only going to end up with one perspective of one set of people in Indian history. A lot of Indian history is actually recorded in lore, in song, in custom. There's all kinds of unwritten sources for history. So those need to be tapped as well. And that, therefore your material may vary, whereas in other cultures, perhaps they may not have this problem of, they may find that actually written records do tend to cover a fair amount of history, whereas with us, that's not quite the case. Now, for example, when I was doing my first book on Travancore, there's that whole official story of Marthandavarma. This king conquers, surrenders his kingdom to the deity. There's an official narrative, and this one's got a lot of currency from the people in positions of power. But what you also find is from the start, from his own lifetime, there was also a counter narrative in the Villapata, which are these songs sung in the Nanjanad region by these folk singers, which actually present the same historical figure as a villain and have a completely different take on his story. So basically, the same figure, you've got one official narrative, you've got a narrative that's from the margins in which the same person is viewed in very different ways. Both of these deserve to be given an equal amount of attention. Both of these deserve to be interrogated and brought on board. So that matters in the Indian context, and in general, the oral history side of things does matter a great deal in India, because we were a culture where even physically it was not possible to keep physical records available for a very long time. Your palm leaves, or whether even if it was a paper in a later stage, given even the climate, it was that the chances of these things deteriorating is much higher than in other parts of the world, where the climate favors the maintenance of these records. Which is precisely why a lot of history was also, the British often found that, oh, Indians don't have history, they only have fable. They only have these stories that they've passed down from generation to generation. But no, that there's a historical reason for it, which is that when you live in a climate where it's not possible to keep extensive records and ensure their passage down the generations, another medium is to sort of couch history in memorable stories and lore, and then pass it down. That is why oral history is so important in the Indian context. So yeah, depending on where you are, the way you approach your historical material will vary. But I mean, the, the, the actual methods by which you make sense of the material, those have certain yardsticks and standards, which I don't think differ depending on what background or what society you come from. The yardstick on in terms of finding history and finding and doing history properly, the methods, etc., those are relatively stable and constant, because there are certain scientific methods that are followed by historians no matter where they are.